Hello and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Today's story is titled, What Did You Do to Mend a Broken Friendship? Soft Reflections from a New York Caf. Our story follows Elliot, a soft-spoken illustrator in his early 40s, whose peaceful routines are quietly interrupted by a familiar voice from his past one that still lingers in his heart. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. The steam from Elliot's coffee drifted upward like a soft ribbon, curling in the November air as he pushed open the narrow glass door of Caf Penumbra, tucked along a quiet corner of 14th Street. This cafe had always been his favorite. Warm, wooden booths, yellowed newspapers pinned to the walls, and the faint smell of cinnamon that somehow never disappeared. He liked the quiet hum of this place. It was a little slower than the rest of Manhattan, and Elliot 41, soft-spoken, with laugh lines deepening at the edges of his eyes, appreciated anything that moved a little slower these days. He took his seat in the far booth, the one with the chipped table corner he once smoothed over. With a folded napkin, he reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a half-filled sketchbook and a pencil dulled from too many nights of anxious drawing. He wasn't in a rush to start, not today. The rain earlier had left the windows fogged, and the air inside held that pleasant, sleepy dampness that made you want to just sit and watch the world. That's when he heard it. A voice, soft, warm, with the same slightly theatrical tone it always had. He couldn't make out the words, but his fingers froze over the sketchbook. It was Cal, whose name Elliot had not said out loud in nearly 8 years. Cal, who used to sit right across from him in this very booth, laughing too loudly and drawing caricatures of strangers on napkins. Cal, who left without finishing a sentence one spring morning in 2017, leaving behind silence and a crushed paper coffee cup. Elliot didn't turn around at first. His pulse quickened, something he hadn't felt in this cafe for years. He stared at the grain in the wood table, breathing through his nose, counting backward from 5. Elliot, the voice said. He turned. Cal looked older, of course. A few more silver threads in his dark hair, a slightly rounder face, but the same tilted smile, the same crooked stance, like he was always mid-joke or on the verge of a dance. Elliot blinked. I didn't mean to interrupt, Cal added. I just wasn't sure if it was you. Elliot cleared his throat. It is. For a moment, they stood in a limbo made of espresso, steam, and awkwardness. Cal motioned vaguely toward the other side of the booth. Do you mind if I sit? Elliot hesitated, then nodded. It's still your booth, technically. Cal chuckled, a soft huff through the nose. We used to call it the Corner of Dreams, didn't we? Only after 3 coffees. They both laughed. It was small, brief, but enough. As Cal slid into the booth, Elliot watched him closely. His coat was damp. He had a book under one arm, dog-eared and scuffed. His eyes darted around, as if searching for memories in the wallpaper. How long's it been? Cal asked. Elliot answered without thinking. 8 years, 2 months, and 4 days. Cal looked up, surprised. You counted, didn't? Need to. That was the last time I came here with you. Every visit since felt a bit, numbered. Cal nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Elliot. Elliot sipped his coffee, bitter, still too hot, still comforting. The server came by. Someone new. Neither of them recognized her. Cal ordered an espresso. Elliot added a slice of almond cake to the order, mostly out of habit. Silence, stretched, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Like putting on a coat you forgot you owned. Cal finally said, You still sketching? Elliot flipped the book toward him. Trying. Some days are just ... pencil days. Still have that habit of drawing strangers and writing little stories about them. Less stories now. More quiet. Cal tilted his head. Still you though. Elliot looked out the window. A woman in a bright yellow coat was walking her dog, who insisted on sniffing every single street lamp. Elliot smiled. That's the kind of thing I'd still draw. Cal smiled too. You always had a way of catching the quiet magic of the city, like it whispered to you. Elliot's pencil rolled across the table and stopped near Cal's hand. Their fingers didn't touch, but the space between them felt charged like an unfinished sentence. The almond cake arrived. Cal raised his eyebrows. Still your favorite. Still reminds me of simpler days. They split the slice. Outside, the clouds began to shift, letting a sliver of afternoon sun stretch across the cafe floor like a sleepy cat. Neither of them noticed, because Elliot was remembering the last time they sat like this, and how everything had gone wrong after. But here Cal was again, not a ghost, not a dream, just a friend with an old smile, trying to find the right words in the same city. And maybe, just maybe, there was time to find them. The espresso arrived in a ceramic cup so small it looked like it belonged to a dollhouse tea party. Cal picked it up carefully, as if afraid he might break the moment. He took a sip, and the bitterness drew a twitch from his mouth. Well, he said, still tastes like burnt hope. Elliot cracked a smile, despite himself. You always said that. I meant it then. Still mean it now. The tension between them shifted slightly. Still there, like steam trapped under a lid, but now flavored with a little laughter. Outside the cafe, a cab honked lazily at a jaywalker. A dog barked in response. Inside, the cafe's slow jazz music barely filled the space between their chairs. So, Cal said, leaning back, do you come here every day? Every Thursday. I like the quiet. Most people are still busy pretending to be busy. This place feels like the last honest corner in the city. Cal nodded. I used to think that, too. Elliot stared at his coffee cup. A bubble of froth had formed in the center, refusing to burst. You didn't say why you left. Not really. Cal swallowed. He glanced out the window, his reflection faint and blurred. I didn't know how, and by the time I did, I thought, maybe it was too late. That's not an answer, Elliot said, softly. No edge in his voice, just quiet truth. Gal looked down at the table. My sister was sick, really sick. I didn't want to talk about it. You were going through your own mess with the gallery pulling your exhibit. I felt like if I brought one more bad thing into our friendship, it would break. Elliot blinked. So you broke it anyway. A long silence followed. Outside, a cyclist wove through slow traffic like a fish slipping upstream. Elliot watched him disappear, wondering how many mornings he'd missed this very conversation. How many could have changed things? I was a coward, Cal said, finally. I didn't know how to show up messy. You were always so calm, so put together. I didn't want you to see me falling apart. Elliot let out a breath that felt like it had been stuck in his lungs for years. I wasn't put together. I just knew how to look like I was. You were the brave one, remember? Cal chuckled bitterly. Not that day. Their server came by, refilled Elliot's water, and gave them a tight-lipped smile before walking away. She must have felt it too, the energy between two people trying not to look directly at a shared wound. Elliot finally said, you didn't just vanish from the cafe. You vanished from everything. I didn't know if you were okay. I didn't even know if you were still in the city. I wasn't, Cal admitted. I left for Boston for a while, took care of family stuff. worked at a hardware store, tried not to think about anything creative. That's hard for you, Elliot said. It was, Cal nodded. Turns out suppressing your entire personality isn't recommended. That made Elliot really laugh, the kind that surprised even himself. It felt like popping bubble wrap in his chest. That sounds like something a therapist would cross-stitch. Maybe I'll get it on a pillow. They both grinned. Something shifted again this time, in the right direction. Cal's eyes softened. I thought about reaching out. I did. Every year on your birthday, I started to write, then I deleted it. Why? I figured you were better off. You had that studio by then. Your name was in a few art blogs. I didn't want to come back like a wet footprint on clean tile. Elliot studied Cal. He looked tired, but not defeated. More like someone who had finally stopped running and was willing to sit still long enough to feel the consequences. You're not a stain. Cal, Elliot said. You were my best friend. Were. He said it without thinking. The past tense slipped out like a misstep on an icy street, Cal noticed, but he didn't flinch. I don't want to be a memory, Elliot. I'd like to try again, if you'd let me. Elliot didn't answer right away. He traced the rim of his coffee cup, feeling the tiny chip in the ceramic with his fingertip. He remembered when they painted the back wall of Elliot's studio together in 2015. Cal had painted a tiny dragon near the floor, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Just to see if you notice, he'd said. It was still there. He thought about that dragon sometimes, when nights were too quiet. I don't know if we can go back, Elliot said. Cal nodded. We don't have to. But maybe, Elliot continued, we could start something new. Cal looked up, hopeful, like Thursday coffee. Elliot smiled. As long as you don't complain about the espresso. No promises, Cal said, holding up his tiny cup. But I'll try to be less dramatic. You, less dramatic, Elliot said, with a chuckle. That's like asking the Hudson to stop flowing. They laughed again, the kind of laugh that fills the cracks in silence. And as they sat there, with espresso cooling and old memories softening, like sugar in tea, Elliot realized something. You don't mend a broken friendship in a single moment. You start with a seat at the table, then a slice of cake, then a story told in a quiet voice, and you listen. And maybe if you're lucky you laugh again. Elliot didn't go straight home after the café. Instead, he took a long walk, half aimless, half instinctual, his boots echoing across damp sidewalks and the hush of late afternoon traffic. The city had a hush to it on Thursdays around 4, a lull between ambition and dinner plans, between work and whatever people pretended was rest. The sky was silver and low, the kind of sky that pressed gently on your shoulders, inviting reflection. And as he passed East 10th and turned onto Avenue B, his feet slowed. The building stood as it always had for stories. Brick scorched a little at the corners, with the same scratched call box that had once required just the right elbow jab to buzz open. The rooftop apartment. Their rooftop apartment. He stood across the street, letting the memory slide back into place, like a soft glove. It was 2017, summer, July. The air had tasted like heat and cheap wine. He and Cal had rented the place for the sole purpose of making things art. Zines, strange little sculptures out of wires and thrift store finds. They were both broke and full of fire, convinced that being hungry meant they were closer to being real artists. Inside, the apartment was barely livable. The floor slanted, the plumbing screamed, and above the kitchenette, a massive thrifted clock ticked unevenly. Tick, tick, TCK, then nothing. It stopped at 3:12 one afternoon. Elliot remembered the exact moment. Cal had been balancing on a chair, trying to stick glow-in-the-dark stars to the ceiling with a spatula. The clock stopped. Cal paused. "I guess time's given up on us," he said, deadpan. Elliot had nearly fallen off the futon, laughing. He hadn't thought about that day in years now. Standing across from that building again, Elliot felt the tug, not of nostalgia, but of something unfinished. Back then, 312 had become their private joke. When they argued, one of them would point to the clock. Still stuck, and somehow it helped. As if the world understood, they were just two stubborn people trying to exist in the same tiny room without breaking everything. He didn't know when it stopped helping. One morning, Cal was simply gone. Left a note that said, "Went to get air, not sure how long," and then nothing for years. Back in the present, Elliot crossed the street and leaned against the building's front steps. The metal banister was cool beneath his hand. He didn't want to go in. He didn't need to. The memory was thick enough to sit beside him like a second coat. He remembered the way Cal used to draw while talking, almost unconsciously. Napkins, receipts, sometimes on Elliot's arm when paper ran out. And that night in August was it. August they had tried to paint each other without speaking. 10 minutes. No corrections. Cal's portrait of Elliot had been chaotic and messy, the eyes too large, the lines too many. But it had felt honest. Elliot's portrait of Cal had been the opposite. Simple, contained, smiling, too clean, too careful. That had been the difference between them, hadn't it? Cal was chaos with a beating heart. Elliot was order pretending not to flinch. The clock above the kitchenette never moved again, and neither did their friendship until today. A horn honked nearby, snapping Elliot out of the spiral. He glanced at his watch. 3:12. He blinked. That couldn't be right, but there it was, 3:12. And suddenly he was laughing out loud, a soft, startled chuckle that felt like a sneeze of emotion. Maybe it was the universe. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe some broken clocks still knew when to show up. He pulled out his phone. Elliot. "Hey, that apartment on Avenue B still exists," Cal typing. "The one with the slanted floor." Elliot. "And the broken clock." Cal. "We really should have fixed that thing." Elliot. "Maybe we weren't supposed to." There was a pause. Then Cal sent a photo. It was a sketch of a clock, the hands at 3:12, surrounded by tiny doodle stars, music notes, a cracked mug, and two figures sitting on a fire escape. One wore a crown made of spoons. The other had paint smudged across his nose. Underneath, Cal had written, "Time didn't break us. We just paused." Elliot stared at it for a long moment, then saved it. Maybe some friendships don't need fixing. Maybe they just need someone to remember where they left the pieces. Union Square was always halfway, in every sense. Halfway between uptown and downtown, between seriousness and leisure. It was a place for protesters and bubble tea, street performers and chess hustlers, office workers on benches, students with earbuds, and the ghosts of friendships that once strolled its edge. Elliot arrived at 11:58 a.m., deliberately early. He chose the third bench from the west corner, by the patch of trees that offered just enough shade. His palms were warm, his coffee lukewarm. He hadn't slept much, but his mind was awake in a slow, thoughtful kind of way, like waiting for a painting to dry. Cal appeared 2 minutes later, wearing the same canvas jacket Elliot remembered from the gallery nights, frayed at the cuffs, paint smudges along the hem like constellations. He carried a tote bag. They didn't hug, not right away. They sat. The city hummed around them, sirens in the distance, a dog barking, the soft, metallic wheeze of someone opening a Snapple. And beneath it all, the quiet thrum of two men sitting side by side after too much silence. Cal reached into the tote and pulled out the sketchbook. Silver tape still held the spine together. The corners were worn, and one page stuck out, crumpled and folded like it had been opened 100 times. He handed it over. Wordlessly. Elliot opened it slowly. The first pages were familiar. Rooftops, alleyways, coffee cups, the crooked windows of their old apartment. He turned each page with care, like lifting memory with tweezers. Then came the drawings of Elliotson from behind, some with furrowed brows, others laughing, and then one that stopped him. It was a sketch of the two of them. They were lying on the rooftop, side by side, staring up at an imagined sky. Cal had drawn stars into it, tiny words in the margins, fears, jokes, things we didn't say. The caption read, 2 clocks, ticking at different speeds. Elliot's voice came softly. You kept drawing after you left. I never really stopped, Cal replied, voice equally low. It's how I listened to what I didn't say out loud. Elliot nodded, still turning pages. I never knew how to say sorry. Not properly. You did, Cal said. You just always said it with silence and tea. They both chuckled. It wasn't the old laugh yet, but it had the bones of one. They sat like that for a while. Cal pulled a bag of dried mango from his pocket and offered Elliot a piece. Like nothing had passed between them, except whether Elliot accepted around them. Union Square moved on Pigeon's negotiating territory, a woman yelling lovingly into her phone, a busker playing Simon and Garfunkel with a slightly broken ukulele. So why now? Cal asked. After all this time. Elliot looked at his hands. Because I sat in a cafe yesterday and saw a photo that reminded me of what time didn't get to erase. And because I'm tired of pretending it didn't matter. That's a lot for one macchiato to carry. Elliot smiled. It was a strong cup. Cal leaned back on the bench, stretching his legs out in front of him. You remember that clock, the one above our stove? 3:12, Elliot replied immediately. I checked once. That's the exact time we ran out of coffee filters during that thunderstorm and used a paper towel instead, Elliot added. You swore it tasted like a wet envelope. It did, Cal grinned. A very determined envelope. The laughter came easier this time, and something softened between them, like the air itself was willing. After a moment, Elliot pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, a newer one, clean cover, fresh pages. I've been trying to draw again, he said, quietly, but I get stuck. Cal tilted his head. What kind of stuck? Elliot paused. Then, the kind where I miss my echo. It wasn't a poetic line. It was just true. Cal nodded slowly. I know that kind. Then, without asking, he took the notebook and began to sketch. They sat in silence. Birds hopping near their feet. The scent of roasted peanuts drifting from a nearby cart. Cal's pencil scratched softly across the page. Elliot watched the faces of passers-by, half seeing them. When Cal handed the notebook back, there was a drawing of 2 trees, trunks bent inward, like they were whispering. Beneath, Cal had written, roots tangled underneath. Elliot blinked. Not from tears, just from the sudden, overwhelming sense of return. They stood, finally, a gentle mutual understanding that sitting had been enough for one day. Same time next week, Cal asked, slipping the silver-taped sketchbook back into his tote. Elliot didn't hesitate. Yeah, let's see what 3:12 brings us next. They parted ways at the corner, with a small wave, no big moments, no dramatic goodbye, just the promise of another sketch. And that, Elliot thought, was more than enough. The next Thursday brought rain, not a hard, cinematic kind, but the sort that lingered like an apology. It tapped gently on windows, collected in shallow puddles, and whispered against umbrellas held a little too close. New York in the rain was a softer version of itself. Like a record turned low in the background, Elliot stood under a blue awning on East Fifth, watching the sidewalk gloss over in shades of gray and amber. His sneakers were slightly wet, the cuffs of his jeans darker than they'd been an hour ago. He didn't mind. The rain was quiet company. Across the street, a laundromat hummed with life machines spinning, fluorescent lights flickering slightly. A woman balanced a yellow basket on her hip, her toddler squealing at the sight of soap bubbles. Ordinary moments Elliot used to collect them. His sketchbook was in his bag, along with a letter he hadn't written until late the night before. A letter meant for Cal, but not to send, to hand over, or maybe not even that, maybe just to write and never share. Some truths sounded better in ink than air. The letter had started with, "I don't remember the last thing I said to you that mattered. I think it was about eggs, or that weird sock I found in the freezer. But I know the last thing I wanted to say was, please don't go." He'd written 4 pages, then folded it once, sealed it, and wrote one word on the outside, "Listen now." Standing in the drizzle, Elliot turned the envelope over in his hands. He didn't know if Cal even needed it. Maybe people heal at different speeds. Maybe Cal had already tucked the old wounds into a drawer marked then and moved on. But Elliot hadn't. Not fully. Not after that night in Alphabet City, 3 years ago, when he came home to an empty apartment and a record player still spinning with no sound. They'd had an argument, a dumb one, about timing, space, Elliot's job interviews, Cal's gallery opening, something about who forgot to RSVP to whose friends exhibit, but beneath the surface, the real argument was always the same. How do you stay close when your dreams pull in different directions? Elliot had paced that night, fuming, and later regretted not chasing Cal when he walked out. "Just give me space," Cal had said, and Elliot, proud and tired, had said nothing, had stayed in the apartment, had eaten cold rice and stared at the stopped clock at 3:12, had written a note, torn it up, written another. None of them said the right thing until last night when he sat at his small desk under a yellow lamp and finally let the words come. He slipped the envelope back into his bag just as Cal arrived, umbrella in one hand, a steaming paper cup in the other. "Hey," Cal said, shaking his umbrella slightly. "You beat me." "Just practicing," Elliot replied. "Thought I'd see if it was still possible to be on time." Cal offered him the extra coffee without asking. "Black, 1 sugar, same bench." Elliot nodded, and they crossed the street together, their shoes making soft splashes in the puddles. They didn't rush. Rain made everything feel slower, and Elliot liked that. They sat, sipped in silence. After a while, Cal pulled something from his tote, tiny painting, no bigger than a postcard. It was of their old rooftop, seen from a strange angle, looking in, not out. The clock was visible in the corner, its hands at 3:12, but this time, stars hovered around it, and 2 mugs sat on the windowsill. "I started this in October," Cal said, voice quiet. "Finished it last night. Figured I'd bring it to you." Elliot blinked. The envelope in his bag felt heavier somehow. "That's beautiful," he murmured. "It looks softer than it was. Nicer." Cal shrugged. "Time does that. Smooths the edges." They sat a moment longer, then Elliot reached into his bag, pulled out the letter, handed it over. Cal raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Something old. Something new." "You can read it later," Elliot said, voice gentler than he'd expected. Cal didn't open it, just slipped it into his own coat pocket with a small nod. Okay, that was it. No fanfare, no revelations, but for Elliot it was a small surrender. A release that the rain lightened, the sun hinted behind clouds like a shy guest peeking into a party. You ever think we overcomplicated everything? Elliot asked after a moment. Of course, Cal said. We were young and dramatic and too smart for our own good. You still are, Cal smirked. Rude, Elliot smiled. True. They finished their coffees as the clouds began to break, casting gold across the square. The kind of gold that made puddles look like melted coins. Elliot stood first this time, stretched. You want to go walk the old block? He asked. Cal looked up at him, then nodded, slowly. Yeah, let's go see if that bodega still sells those weird peach sodas and the empanadas that were always either incredible or a health risk. Cal laughed. 50-50 odds, I'm in. As they walked away from the bench, the letter in Cal's pocket and the painting in Elliot's hand, it felt like something had clicked back into place, not perfectly, but enough. Maybe that's all friendships are, just long walks back toward each other in the rain. It turned out the bodega was still there, same cracked red awning, same tiny bell that jingled as they walked in. The peach sodas were still on the bottom shelf of the fridge, partially hidden behind a stack of energy drinks. Elliot reached for two and handed one to Cal with a smirk. Expired last month, he said, pointing to the date. So, still within the danger zone. Cal laughed. Perfect. Just like old times, mild risk and sugar. Behind the counter, the owner, an older Dominican man with deep laugh lines and a Yankees cap, nodded at them with a vague recognition. He was slicing plantains, the scent of oil and spices curling into the air like a memory. He hadn't changed much. Neither had the handwritten sign above the fryer. No refunds. Only salsa empanadas, Cal asked. One beef, one mystery, Elliot replied, bold. They waited by the window, elbows on the slightly greasy counter, watching the rain taper off into mist. It was late afternoon now, the kind of hazy light that made the city feel suspended, quieter than it really was. Cal tapped the glass bottle gently against the ledge. So, are we talking about that night? Elliot didn't answer right away. He took a sip of soda sweet, slightly metallic, but familiar. I think we already did, he said finally. In bits, over mango slices and umbrella walks. Cal nodded. Fair. But Elliot turned to look at him. That night, though, I kept thinking you'd come back. Cal blinked slowly. I almost did. Twice. Once, at 1 a.m., standing at the corner. Then again, a week later, with a grocery bag and a bad excuse. What stopped you? Cal stared at the rain-streaked window. I was angry and tired. And maybe I thought you didn't care enough to chase me. Elliot leaned back against the wall. I thought chasing you would make it worse. I thought, ... you needed space. Cal turned toward him, expression unreadable for a moment. That's the thing with space. It can be breathing room or it can be abandonment. Sometimes they look the same. They were quiet again. But it wasn't. Awkward. The empanadas arrived in a wax paper bag, steaming golden, slightly misshapen like they always were. Elliot took a bite and made a face. Still no idea what the mystery one is. Let me try. Cal leaned in and took a bite from the other side. They both paused. Pumpkin, Elliot guessed. Pumpkin and cheese. They both shrugged, chewing thoughtfully. Not bad, Cal said. Not good either, Elliot replied. Another beat of silence passed. Then Elliot spoke again, voice softer. I read something last week, said friendship isn't about forgiving or forgetting. It's about remembering gently. Cal looked over. You get that from your meditation podcast. Maybe, Elliot smiled. Or the side of a tea bag. Well, either way. Cal said, it's not wrong. They left the shop, paper bag folded neatly between them, and began walking the familiar streets of Alphabet City. The rain had left everything with that fresh, soaked earth scent. Cars rolled by with wet tires. A bike courier passed, singing softly to himself. I still think about that rooftop, Cal said, after a while. That night we watched the blackout spread across Jersey, and you swore you could see Mars. You still can, Elliot said, pointing upward. If you squint, Cal laughed. That was the first time I heard you say you wanted to stay in one place. Elliot nodded slowly. I didn't mean New York. I meant with you. They reached the intersection near their old apartment. The building was still, their graffiti brighter, the corner deli replaced with a boutique dog bakery. Cal squinted. Gentrification smells like peanut butter treats. They crossed the street and stood in front of the entrance. The buzzer panel was scratched, the paint flaking. Remember the kid on the third floor? Cal asked. The one who used to sell magic rocks for $1. Arthur, Elliot said. He gave me one that was just gravel wrapped in foil. Told me it kept bad vibes out. I still have one in my sock drawer. Elliot turned to him, surprised. Seriously? Cal grinned. It works. I haven't had a single vampire in there. They both laughed again this time. Fuller. Freer. It was strange how easily they slipped back into it. Not into the exact same version of themselves, but into something real, wiser, maybe, weathered, like the city around them. At the building's steps, they paused. The moment felt heavy in the right kind of way. I don't want to rewind everything, Elliot said. Just move forward with better shoes. Cal chuckled. Shoes that don't squeak in galleries. Exactly. He hesitated, then added, I'd like to keep doing this, not just sketching or walking, talking, honestly, if that's okay. Cal looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, firmly. It is. Elliot exhaled, barely realizing he'd been holding it in. Same time next week? Cal asked. Same time, Elliot echoed. They turned and began walking back toward the park, not in a hurry, just letting the city carry them for a while. And maybe, just maybe, the conversation wouldn't ever really end. It would just keep unfolding. In the way good friendships do, soft, honest, with enough room for silence and laughter in equal measure. As twilight deepened, Elliot and Cal found themselves wandering toward Washington Square Park. The city lights flickered on, one by one, like fireflies awakening from a nap. The fountain murmured softly, droplets catching the glow of the street lamps. The sound was calming, a gentle, watery lullaby. Elliot adjusted the collar of his coat and took a slow breath. The cool air smelled faintly of damp leaves and roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. It was the kind of evening that made you feel both small and infinite at once. They settled onto a worn wooden bench near the arch, the one where they used to talk for hours, sharing dreams and doubts with reckless honesty. Do you remember the time you tried to teach me how to juggle? Cal asked, smiling. Elliot chuckled softly. I was terrible at it. Dropped the balls more times than I caught them. Your hands looked like confused spiders, Cal teased. But you kept trying. Elliot smiled, eyes tracing the stars that began to emerge. Maybe that's the trick with friendship. Keep trying, even when you fumble. They fell into a comfortable silence, watching as a group of musicians tuned their guitars nearby. A young woman played a soft melody, the notes drifting through the air like feathers. Cal pulled out the letter Elliot had given him earlier. I read this on the subway, he said quietly. Your words, ... they're softer than I expected. Elliot looked away, a little embarrassed. I was trying to be mission accomplished. They shared a laugh, light and easy, before Cal's expression turned thoughtful. You know, he said, sometimes I think we're like this park, constantly changing but always the same place. People come and go, seasons shift, but the roots are still here. Elliot nodded slowly. And maybe the roots are what keep us together, even when the branches grow apart. A cool breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter from a nearby playground. Somewhere, a dog barked once, twice. Do you ever think about how we ended up here? Elliot asked. Cal shrugged. I guess all roads lead back to the places where we felt most alive. For me, that's this city. And, well, you. Elliot's cheeks flushed faintly in the dim light. They stayed on the bench, letting the evening wrap around them like a soft blanket. No rush to speak, no pressure to fill the quiet, just two friends, mending the delicate threads of their story, one gentle step at a time. The city's hum softened as night settled fully over Alphabet City. Elliot and Cal stood together, gazing up at the twinkling constellation above the arch. Their breath made tiny clouds in the cool air, the world around them slowing to a gentle, soothing pace. Before parting ways, Elliot took a deep breath and spoke in a low, calm voice, one meant not just for Cal, but for anyone listening in the quiet moments between wakefulness and sleep. Close your eyes gently, like a soft petal, falling to the ground. Feel the weight of your body settling into the surface beneath your bed, your chair, or the floor. Let your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclench. Imagine the gentle night air wrapping around you like a warm, familiar scarf. Breathe in, slowly through your nose. Hold it just for a moment, and then exhale softly through your mouth. Let each breath be a wave, pulling away any tension, any heaviness. Picture the city at night, the street lamps glowing like fireflies, the distant echo of footsteps on cobblestone, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Know that, just like this city, you are alive, changing, and perfectly imperfect. Let any worries drift away, like paper boats floating down a quiet river. You don't need to hold on to them tonight. Now, imagine a warm light glowing inside your chest, spreading slowly outward to your fingertips and toes. It's gentle, it's steady, it's yours. As you rest here, remember that every friendship, every connection, is a story unfolding, sometimes tangled, sometimes smooth, and sometimes it's okay to simply be. When you're ready, take one last deep breath, feeling calm and safe. Then, let your mind drift, soft and slow, into a peaceful sleep. Elliot and Cal shared a quiet smile, a wordless promise to carry this calm with them. They parted at the park's edge, footsteps light on the pavement. The night whispered around them, carrying the echo of soft laughter and gentle hope. And as the city settled beneath the stars, so too did their hearts quiet, mended and ready to dream. Good night.